Uncomfortable conversations about culture and Christianity. Today, I am joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And also joined by our special guest, Larry Dirksen. I said that right?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Usually you're supposed to ask that before you say it live, but I failed to do
You did
that.
great.
Thank you. So today we're going to have a conversation around overall the topic of shame. Larry helps lead and founded a ministry called No Shame. But before we get into all of that, let's just get to know Larry as a person, a little bit about just who you are now, maybe some of your background, and then we'll kind of get into what caused you to form this ministry and some of the help and things that it can provide. So
Sounds
the floor
great.
is yours.
All right. Well, now I actually work as a safety director as we're building our nonprofit. But I've got a degree in psychology and human services. I think most people who get those degrees do it because they're working on themselves, or at least that was the case with me. I was raised in a very abusive home with an alcoholic father, and my earliest memories was abuse, hearing my dad abuse my mother. I remember waking up and hearing fighting, and then standing at the door, and then peeking outside the door and looking at my mom to see if she was okay, and she would try to compose herself and then, brush me back to my room to close the door because she didn't want any trouble for me. So most of my life, my early life, was filled with fear. And that situation kind of came to a head when I was 8, and my grandparents were over, and my grandfather actually had a heart attack.
Wow.
And he was lying on the ground, and my dad was standing over him, kicking him in the chest, saying, "Get up, you faking old man."
Wow.
But it brought an opportunity for law enforcement to come out, paramedics, and that was when my mom was able to get me out of the house.
Wow.
And my brother and sister as well. So my first 8 years were just filled with fear, anxiety, and I truly believed that at one point in time my dad was going to come in, kill my mom, and kill all of us. And actually later in life he admitted as much.
Wow. So as I have 8-year-olds and younger at my house too, and I'm just thinking of how much of that foundation of your life, seeing that, how did that start to take root as you move into middle school and move throughout adolescence? How did that shape you as a man? And I guess, how did those traumas begin to play out as you're kind of growing older?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I was extremely traumatized. I was filled with fear every night. I had nightmares. I had attachment issues. My mom was so much trying to deal with her own trauma that it was hard for her to attach to me. I couldn't attach to my father, so I couldn't attach with people in school. So I was kind of the outcast, the loner, and it really had a major impact on me all the way through high school.
Wow. So when did you start to realize, this is becoming a problem and it needed to be addressed? Was there like a moment or a series of things as you're growing older? You're like, I don't have attachments. I don't have any of this. What was kind of the head of that?
It took many years. Actually, it was in my 40s before I actually started dealing with my mental health. Prior to that, my son had come down with brain cancer, another traumatic event. His mother had left. It was too much for her to handle. And I was the Christian who just believed, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, pray more, just have more faith, and then everything will just be fine. And I was very much against anything mental health, anything psychology, counseling.
Yeah.
We had actually 2 suicides in my church.
Wow.
A father of 10, and then my son's best friend died by suicide. And at that point in time in my life, I was just about there myself.
Wow.
And that's when I knew I've got to address this.
Up until that point, how were you coping with living with that trauma, and even the trauma of like your son going through cancer and all the different things that you're experiencing up to that point? How were you coping or filling those voids or kind of getting through the day? Was it just kind of like white knuckling it through every day?
Exactly. I was denying it. I was saying that faith should be enough, and Jesus is enough. But I was white knuckling it. My anxiety was increasing. It was having an impact on me physically, mentally, my clarity. And it just kept building and building and building till I got to a point where I started to believe life wasn't worth living anymore. And then, like I said, I had 2 suicides within 2 months in our church, and I was right there, and I just knew I was in trouble.
Mm-hmm. So what caused you to reach out and finally get that professional help? Because I think for so many Christians, this is a familiar story where I think oftentimes one of the faults of the church at large is, we do teach that there's freedom in Christ, and we believe that, and we do, know that Christ can heal and he can do amazing things, and the power of the Holy Spirit is powerful, but Christ also uses our brains and rewiring of that and medical professionals and all that kind of stuff to bring healing into people's lives. So what was like the catalyst for you to finally go from, hey, I want to end my own life, to finding that healing in your own life?
You had me, legalistic Larry, doing a Bible study in my home, trying to perform, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you do. You got to be good enough. You overcome it by performance. And I had a gentleman that attended the Bible study in my home, and he one day felt like God was calling him to share his testimony. And it was a story of schizophrenia, and that when he was unmedicated and untreated, how he had been hospitalized repeatedly, and some of the things that have been part of his past, and I couldn't believe it. This was one of the most dependable people I knew, who was a friend to me. We studied God's Word together, and when he told me a story, it just got me thinking, maybe my whole perspective on mental health and this is just totally wrong.
Wow.
Is that kind of what made you take the next step into finding that for yourself?
It wasn't. And the funny thing is that I did it kind of secretly. My wife didn't even know. I went to the doctor, and I just told my general physician about my struggles, and he prescribed me an antidepressant, and it took the edge off. And it was about 2-3 months after that, because of the shame, that I finally told my wife, because she's noticed a little difference in me. And I told her that I went to the doctor and that I was seeking help for my mental health, and that I was taking medication.
Yeah. So before we get into why you launched, No Shame, I'm going to audible a little bit and just talk about, because you're talking about that shame. And I think that shame is such a pervasive thing in our culture, but especially I think it can latch on in Christian culture as well, because we feel like we have to perform, like you were saying. We have to white knuckle it. We have to get it done. We can't let anybody see what's under the surface. And yet, even though we see when people are courageous enough, like the gentleman in your Bible study, to open up and kind of bear their wounds in somebody's life, there's just this refreshing. You feel like you can breathe. The air is lifted out of the room because you're like, oh, me too. Somebody else is going through something like this. But I'd love to just hear, what, maybe especially a little bit from you, Jess, as you're having people in your office. And I think the mental health stigma is going away more and more, but I think shame really does want to keep things in the dark. It wants to keep secrets. It wants to keep us from talking to our spouses, or even when we do know we need help, it keeps us buried down there. So we have to kind of be secretive about the help that we're seeking, or the ways that we're looking on WebMD or YouTube. Like, how do I deal with these mechanisms? So how at large do you see shame, whether in the Christian culture, in your counseling seat, Jess? How is it pervasive inside of our society, and how much power does it really have?
I think shame plays such a huge part in our society, because we are so performance based, and it's such an isolating thing to know that because so much shame does come from trauma, and it comes from this feeling of this inner voice that we have towards ourselves, or this belief that we have over ourselves. And so sometimes we mix up guilt and shame, where guilt might be because of a behavior. It might be because of something we actually did wrong, where shame comes from these negative beliefs that we have about ourselves, or negative experiences that we've had, or our traumas that give us these ideas about ourselves. And I feel it's so sneaky, because we isolate. I don't want you to know the things that I feel shameful about. I don't want you to know my experiences. I want you to see this bright, beautiful picture of myself and of my personality. And I want to match whatever society thinks that I should have. And so I think that we're changing the tide, and people like you, Larry, help change the tide where it's like, I want to see your vulnerability. That's where we grow. That's where we heal. But we're also in a culture that's very performative. I'm comparing myself to, we compare ourselves to people constantly of like, this is the ideal that we should be, and I'm not this, and I'll never be like this because of where I come from or what I experienced. And so I think it's very pervasive, and it's almost a silent epidemic, I would say, of like this shame hidden cover that we have.
Yeah, as we've been,
I don't know if you would agree, Larry.
Oh, absolutely.
With that, or probably add.
I would go so far as to say it started right in the beginning in Adam and Eve in the Bible. What happened? They sinned, and Adam and Eve hid.
Yeah.
They hid from God. They hid from each other. They tried to cover themselves, and that's what we do, right?
Yeah.
We have something that is a flaw in us, or even something that happened to us, and instead of doing what God would have us to do, bring it out in the light, and confess to community and share our problems and be a help to one another. No, we isolate, we hide.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, because that's what they did. They went and they hid from God in the forest. They tried to hide their shame. They tried to hide their blame too. Like, no, it was the woman that you gave me. And she was like, no, it's the serpent. And so there does become just that cycle, like, that you said that kind of started in the beginning. And one of the things that we've heard, Jess and I, over the last couple weeks, we've been having just a series on our body image, and we had a gentleman, Nate, who was talking about his journey with obesity, and really at the core of what got him there was shame. And then we had on the whole other end of the spectrum, we had a gal, Olivia, talk about her journey with an eating disorder and anorexia, and what kept her bound was shame. And so almost any area of our life, shame is that thing that ultimately I think the enemy wants to use to keep us bound, to keep us from actually finding freedom inside of that. And so I think it's such a big thing inside of our lives. And so
shame derives a lot of its power from secrecy.
Yeah.
And I totally believe it's the plan of the enemy. He wants to steal, kill, and destroy. Like a pack animal, he waits for one to be injured or wounded or move away from the pack, and then you're vulnerable.
Yeah. And it keeps you thinking, I'm the only one going through this. If I tell someone, then this is going to, be the outcome. And so you start to write all these narratives that kind of keep you in bondage instead of you finding freedom. So as you're beginning to find your freedom, from shame, and starting that healing journey, what did that look like, I guess, professionally, as far as getting into finding counseling, stop white knuckling it? What was that journey towards healing looking like for you?
Well, I had a lot of challenges that a lot of people in our culture have. First of all, my employer did not provide mental health insurance.
Okay.
Secondly, I didn't have the type of job where I could take off during the day, go to a counseling appointment, see a psychiatrist, and work on myself. So it's a big part of how No Shame came together, which we'll talk about later. But ultimately, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to find help. Therapists work traditionally, day hours. It's hard to get into a therapist as it is because there's so much need. And then if you want one that, that works during the evenings, it takes even longer. So it was very much a challenge. And No Shame really served as my help when I was going through my journey.
Yeah, and you probably could testify to all of those things that Larry was saying, Jess. That's the reality I always hear, at City Cares. Is just such an overwhelming need. Obviously, a lot of counselors and therapists are, there during the day, and always people are coming in.
It is such a need, and I think a lot of people. I mean, maybe you don't know, like, just from the side of a therapist, it's like, it's heartbreaking to, like, get those emails of, like, this is where I'm at. And then to look at my schedule and to not have room for them, like, that is so heartbreaking. And so it is that there are conversations even on the side of the professional of, like, man, I wish there was two of me, or I wish that it's such a balance because I want to break my boundaries of like, okay, this is how much I can handle in a week to help more people. But I know that that's not good for me. But yes, there is such a need for that. And it is such a balance. And it's such a conversation that we have in the background of on the professional side too, of like, what more can we have? And so having resources and other ways that people can have support in the meantime or additionally in the week, because we're only giving an hour, are so important.
Yeah. And I think from the pastoral side, you know, there's so many times I'm meeting with someone in my office, whether it's about an addiction or their marriage is falling apart or gender identity kinds of things. And I want to listen very well. I want to pray with them and seek hope and help. But I also have to realize I'm not a specialist. Like, I am a pastor. I love God's word. I believe that Jesus gives hope and healing, and there's ways for that to happen. But I also have seen a lot of pastors try to overly put on the professional hat of I'm a licensed therapist when they don't have that training. And to me, that would be like, you know, me going to my general practitioner with a torn ACL and then just expecting them to work on it. No, they would send me to a specialist and say, we need to get you to the right doctor that can get you the right help. And so as a pastor, I feel that tension as well of I want them to get into, you know, therapy, and I want them, but then you talked about all those barriers. Like, I'm like, hey, here's the pathway to healing, but man, I just can't afford it. Or yeah, I just don't have a job where I can take, like, it's either I work my job or I go get counseling, or, you know, I can't do it at night. Otherwise I'm going to be not with my kids ever. And so there are so many of those real barriers that I think you brought up that even on top of that, I often don't think about. So,
well, and I agree too. When you look at the numbers, over 20% of people in our culture will go through mental health distress over the course of a year. 5.6% of people in our culture have a serious mental illness, meaning they struggle to get through their day, their family life, their work life, their school life. So the need that the professionals and the pastors is being approached with is just beyond what they can do by themselves.
Yeah, and those numbers aren't going down with Gen Alpha and the anxious generation, as it's been dubbed, that have lived on screens and are being introduced to traumas and pains and all of that even younger. That need is not becoming lesser; it's becoming greater to fill those voids. And so, let's talk about that. You said you found, you know, obviously through counseling and therapy, some of that healing, but we're trying to get into that void and talk about No Shame and how it began and how it's starting to serve in those spaces in between.
Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, No Shame started because I needed help and I didn't know where to go. And I'm a recovering pastor. For 8.5 years, I pastored a small church in Denison, Iowa. And so I did what I knew what to do, get people together at the church I attend who struggle with mental health. And we started doing a simple Bible study, and we had a interpersonal 30 minutes where people shared their story, what was going on in their life, and come to realize that all these people had a very similar story. And it became a very safe, very healthy place. And the community and the intimacy that developed in this community, just by having a place where people can be transparent and real and share what's going on with them, just created relationships. And then I learned so much about mental health, my own and others, and other kind of conditions just through this community. So that was our simple start. It was just me trying to find some way to help myself before I was actually able to get into therapy. And
Wow. And I think you paint that picture, and, you know, pragmatically, I'm like, yes, that's great. Everybody should have a space that they can go and be honest and transparent and authentic. But the other side of me, the fear side of me, is like, yeah, but how do I get into that club? Or how do I know that it's safe, right? Like, how do I know that these people are actually safe if I come bare all of my secrets, all the worst parts about me, and that how did you begin to foster that true safety in that kind of community?
You know, it's funny that that was the first fear. You know, if I go out, you know, someone who's trying to lead the group, and I pour out myself and my truth, and other people do it, how are we going to ensure that this remains safe and people's information is being shared? I can tell you in 5 years, I've not had one case of somebody sharing what was going on in another person's life. And I think if you get to this place of intimacy to where you actually hear people sharing their stories and you become comfortable enough to share your story, it becomes like, well, I wouldn't share your story because I don't want my story shared.
Yeah.
So it's just been a blessing. It's just something that comes very naturally that you're pouring out your heart, others are, and you don't want to betray that trust and that relationship that you've created.
So is it something that started at your church as a group, and then you were like, hey, we've got something here because we're filling a gap, like while people are waiting for therapy or providing extra support? How did you decide to kind of make that bigger?
Something that I haven't talked to you guys about. We did that for about 3 years, and then my nephew was actually the target quote shooter about 2 years ago, January.
Okay.
He was schizophrenic, had 5 hospitalizations. No matter how many times he was put in the hospital, they kept him 3 days. They let him go. He wasn't getting help, and finally he went into Target. The true story is he fired into the ceiling, told everyone to get out, waited for law enforcement to show up. When law enforcement showed up, he said, please get this over with. The officers told him, repeatedly, put your gun down. And he said, please don't make me kill you. And then they did what they had to do.
Yeah.
But it was at that moment that I knew there was so much need, so much pain in our culture. And I know the pain and everything I went through. Yeah. And it's like, we need to share this. Yeah. We need to create a place where all these people, this 20% of people who are hurting, have a place to go where they can have community. And I think we can work on mental wellness, which is what No Shame is about, instead of waiting for mental illness.
That's good. Yeah, and what a catalyst, obviously, and a painful thing, to go through as an uncle, and to watch all of those things. And so as you began this process and this journey for No Shame, I guess what's the journey been like since those last couple of years, in kind of forming a ministry that a little bit more formal, and getting this into spaces where people can have more access to it?
It's challenging. You have to develop trust. And a lot of times I get the question, well, what qualifies you? And it can be challenging. Yeah, I've got my bachelor's degree, but it doesn't, put me in a position to where I have the credentials to do anything specific, but experience does. Sitting around a table with people in the community and sharing in their stories, seeing their victories, seeing them grow as they get in these No Shame communities. So really it's going about championing, cheerleading, talking to different churches, talking to different counseling agencies, and saying, hey, we know you guys are overwhelmed with what you're trying to deal with. We can create a peer environment to where we can help you, where we can help teach mental wellness, that we can create attachments, to where at 10 o'clock at night, when someone's having a rough time, they have a peer within their group that they can call and can help de-escalate things. So it's been a real challenge because we're unknown, but it is my belief at some point in time we will become the Christ-based AA of mental health, and that we very much could be a national program, and we need the engagement of pastors and we need the engagement of therapists to help make sure that we can do this the best way that would serve the people the best.
That's so good. And it seems like you're clearly saying you need those things, so you're not trying to create this other space or try to reject those types of things. And when you talk about just creating that attachment, there's so much isolation that shame causes and so much loneliness. And when you're in those lonely, desperate moments and you don't have someone to call, Jess, the people that she works with, they don't have her cell phone number. They can't just call her anytime, right? Like as a minister, not everybody has access to me 24/7. There's a lot of people, that do, but I cannot carry that burden for a large congregation or even, the people that I get to shepherd all the time. And so creating these kinds of communities are needed inside of the church. And I would say probably people in the mental health space would say we need people to have these healthy attachments, that they have the people, especially if mental health's driven them away from attachment, or driven them away from their family, or driven them away from church and authentic community. There's this need for people that are created in God's image, and part of that being created in God's image is we're created for community, and shame wants to isolate and not put us in community. And so, yeah, from that seat, I can see how just even having that attachment and having that person that, man, when I'm having these thoughts or I'm having these anxious moments, that I can call and I can know is going to pick up. Just the ability to breathe for somebody in those spaces is something holy and something beautiful. I mean, that's from my perspective, pastoral perspective. Would you say the same, Jess?
Yeah, I would say that I feel like, Larry, you're describing like we're on the front lines of an issue, an epidemic. It's such a stigma that people are afraid to step into. And not only that, but there's such a need for people who love Jesus and know that their identity is in Christ to help people attach to that and to be rooted in that. And when there's nobody there to answer the phone, to know like I have a community that cares about me and another resource, but I also have a God that loved me then and loves me now. And to be able to share that truth and share that lived out is a whole nother advantage that we have as Christ followers, and just people that have experienced brokenness and healing, to be able to share that with other people through experiences. And so I think that that's such a gift that we have, and that you have too, Alex, as a pastor, to be able to give that to people too.
That's one of the pushbacks I've received as I've tried to expand No Shame, to other churches. The churches own the groups, by the way. It's not a No Shame group. It's a church group, and we're just trying to help give them the resources to create a culture that's healthy. But a lot of churches want people to get into city groups or whatever they call their home groups,
journey groups, small, whatever, life groups.
But they don't always understand. People can't understand what they can't understand. And I use the analogy of, Jess, I don't know if you're a mom.
Yes, I am.
But it'd be like me having a conversation about childbirth and how easy it is, and you just go through 40 weeks, and then you take an epidural, and then it's a piece of cake.
Yeah.
And you probably want to punch me in the mouth hearing those things.
It's not that easy.
I think mental health you can't understand unless you understand it. And I know normal groups, you have 80% of the people there who want to understand, but they just can't. And an example would be where I attend church, we had a young lady who became a No Shame member who went to a group and was actually a group led by a pastor. And then during the group, during their check-in, said, "Hey, I'm having suicidal ideations." And she walked out that door without one person saying a word to her that night. And you could have heard a pin drop. And people just can't understand what they can't understand. It's not that they don't care. It's just people don't know what to do with it. So being with other people who can understand, to see two people across the room looking each other in the eyes, and it's like, oh my gosh, this person's telling my story.
Yeah.
It's powerful, and it creates a bond that you just can't imagine.
Yeah. And I think how you talked about you guys are in a space of mental wellness. I lead our kind of membership class in the week on community, and our goal is we want people at Christ Community Church to be in community groups. We know, hey, Sunday morning preaching is fine and it's okay, but you need to be in community where we do life together. But one of the things we pause every single time and say is, and if your best next step is not general population, quote unquote, community group, we're in such a luxury place where we do have a church that cares about all this stuff. And I'm like, we have renewal groups on Tuesday nights. Man, if you're going through a divorce, divorce care is probably your best next step, not just getting plugged into a community group. If you just suffered loss, or you suffered loss 5 years ago and you never dealt with your grief, you need to go to Grief Share before getting into a general population group. Or maybe, there's so many different ones. We've talked about Hannah's Prayer for people that have gone through what's the
child loss?
Yeah, child loss, infant and child loss, infertility. So,
yeah.
And for so many people, that's getting into that wellness journey is where they need to go to find hope and healing. before getting into, a group where, again, you get into a group and you feel like it's a bunch of normal people that don't have any of the problems that I have, and that actually drives you further into isolation.
It does.
Rather than into finding hope and finding freedom. And so sometimes, and I get the heart behind, yeah, we want you to be a part of our community groups and our city groups and all of those things so you can have community and life. But yeah, you don't know what you don't know. If you haven't walked in those places, it's hard to have empathy for it. And it's not because people are mean or bad. Like one of the things my wife and I have learned, I've talked about on the podcast, is we have a daughter who's deaf, and I just didn't know about that community before. I didn't not care about them. I knew they were valuable, people made in God's image, but I just didn't have the space or the proximity to understand and have the empathy for people in the deaf community. And now that I have a daughter there, I'm able to understand it in a different space. And I don't expect Jess to understand it at the same level as me. And that's okay. And so I think you bringing up that point, I'm grateful, from CCC's vantage point that we have that space. And I would love to see that in more churches, that see those needs and are facilitating the allowance for other ministries that have the resources and tools and put together curriculum and all those things to say, hey, we trust those things.
Yeah.
And we need these things inside of our church. And so, yeah, thanks for
And
what
I
you
don't
do.
think that our church got there overnight. Like it's a growing
And we're not
process.
perfect.
It's like right. I was going to say, it's like growing pains to be able to see the need. And there's been so many of us behind the scenes that advocate and say, hey, there's a need. Like, let's be the boots on the ground that are getting this moving or showing the need or creating that safe space for people. And so it really is, I don't know, there is growing pains, but there is a need just for people to be advocating for that and to be advocating for just mental health awareness in the church.
Yeah.
And that those people they're welcome in community groups. They'll find healing and people very specific to what they're going through in renewal groups or other community groups that are specific to them. But
Yeah. So, Larry, just share with us maybe a story or a testimony or two of, you don't have to share names or anything, but of people that have taken the bold step, the courageous step to be in a no shame community and kind of what you've been able to see God do in people's lives.
Yeah, there's one young lady in particular that I told you went to that Bible study and said she had suicidal ideations. She had a rough couple years following that, but she came into No Shame, became part of the community. She did the work. She was seeing a counselor at City Care. She was in a very abusive relationship, and over the course of a couple of years, being a part of her counseling or therapy, being a part of No Shame, she is just thriving. Early on, she literally had a couple suicide attempts, and today she is out of that harmful relationship. She's independent, she's doing well, and she's just absolutely thriving. And the suicidal ideations, the suicidal attempts, they've gone away.
Yeah.
Another good example is we had a young man who had OCD scrupulosity, and scrupulosity is the fear of God, basically. You're afraid you committed the unpardonable sin, or that you're not chosen, you're not the elect, and it's just terrorizing. And I would go over to his house, and he'd be laying on the ground, and he'd be convulsing. And he became part of the No Shame community. He was a little resistant to go in and get medicated, get the medication he needed to deal with it, but he did. Did not have any success getting him to go into a counselor, but just by being in No Shame and being in community, over the course of 2 years, he was just totally transformed. He had this heaviness every time he'd come in early on, and then now he's got this lightness about him, and now he's actually running one of our No Shame groups. So
Wow.
in the course of 3 years, he went from really convulsing on the floor in his bad moments to becoming a leader, and he's such a believer that he's leading a group.
So if somebody were to show up to a No Shame group for the first time, what would they expect? Like, how do you run your group? Is it like an hour?
It's about an hour and a half.
Okay.
It is a 3/3 format. So the first third is interpersonal, kind of a check-in, how you doing?
Okay.
So we can connect, know how to pray for each other. The middle third is a wellness topic. So we leave personal counseling and professional things to the professionals, but we do general wellness topics for 30 minutes to discuss how we can work and improve on our mental wellness. And then the last third is small group huddles. So you get a little group of 3 or 4 guys, 3 or 4 girls. They get together and they talk about questions that pertain to the lesson that we had that day. So we're kind of helping each other, hold each other accountable to growth. Are you going to your doctor's appointments? Are you taking your medications? Are you doing the things that you need to do for mental wellness?
Yeah, and if someone's listening, they like, I want to be a part of one of those right now, and maybe
Yeah.
their church doesn't have one or whatever. How does somebody get plugged in? How do they take that step and know where in the world do I find one or any of those things?
Yep, they can go to our website at noshameministries.org, and if you go under groups, it'll tell you the 6 groups we currently have in Omaha. We have one here at Christ Community. Also, there'll be a phone number and a how to reach us contact, and send us an email. We'll get back in contact with you and help them with that transition, getting into a group.
Great. What are, if somebody is having some of those fears, or I think the natural barriers that Satan wants to keep them bound. You've got the fear of walking in for the first time, and I don't know anybody, that fear of judgment, that fear of, is this actually safe space? Like what does, if I call and tomorrow is my first meeting, just walk me through what like that process will be as like the new person anytime I walk into a space and I don't know anybody, I'm going to be a little bit timid, but walking into a space where I know, and I'm potentially going to be here to let out some of the worst things about me or let people know about my mental illness, like help us just breathe and know maybe as a new person, what just that process that you guys have built is going to look like for somebody walking into that for the first time.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how often that's the case, and people express, I'm not comfortable coming myself. A lot of times we'll have someone meet them ahead of time and get to know them a little bit and let them feel more comfortable. But one of our success stories that's really neat, there was this young lady who had this social anxiety, and she came in and you could literally see her trembling. Mm-hmm. And we are very intentional about creating a culture to where anyone who walks in that door, they get a greeting by everybody, a warm smile. She was greeted. She went and she found a seat, and we started check in, and we started doing our topic, and we were going through a particular book. So one of the people gave her a book. She was like, "Oh no, I don't want your book." And it was just so loving, and "Oh no, I want to give you this book." So week 1, she's very quiet. You can hardly get her to say anything. By the time we were like 4 or 5 weeks in, she's chatty Cathy, and she's attending 2 groups a week because, once again, she feels like she's got this place where she fits in, where she's being loved, and it's a place where she can thrive. So
That's amazing.
it's just that culture that very naturally forms when you have that shared experience. It's like military veterans who've seen battle on the battlefield. You can't get them to talk to anybody, but you get them around each other, and there's this camaraderie, and they share and open up, and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I think oftentimes in my own life, I was literally having a moment, a few weeks ago. My son joined a new team, and everybody else that's on his team, they've been a part of it before. So he's the new kid, and I'm like, okay, my son is going to do fine, but I'm the parent that is there around the other parents. I am like intimidated as heck because I'm like, all these people are cooler than me. They all know way more than me. They're probably looking at me like, who's this guy? And I'm like so intimidated by all of these people, and I write all of these stories in my mind of, why they're scary or why I'm not going to talk to them. They're all, talking, and they have this relationship, and I'm just kind of the guy, clasping my hands on the outside and feeling all of those insecurities, just like I'm 12 again. Mm-hmm. And then the other, like Monday night, because it happened like 3 weeks in a row, and I'm like, just go talk to the people. They're going to let you in. And it's just amazing how that narrative, even for us as adults, like acceptance is the oxygen of adolescence, but it's also as us as adults. And so we all desire to be accepted. But if you take that step in that pursuit and start having conversations with people, like they're normal. They're fine. It's okay. But how often?
Or they
like
also
even,
have their own issues.
Yeah, or they also have their own issues. But man, that fear and writing other people's narratives and all that kind of stuff, it can just keep us from joy and having fun and again isolated. And so I love that No Shame.
And I
helping
think
with
that's we create an intentional culture, but there's a particular church in town that I went to, and you could not go through the doors and get to your seat without 10 people welcoming you and letting you know how happy they are that you're there. We can create that culture, and we can make it totally different. You go to that team activity, and imagine what it'd be like if every parent came up and said, "Hey, this is who I am. Nice to have you with us. What do you do?"
Yeah.
If we have the right mindset, we can create communities where people who are struggling, that do feel like outcasts, can feel at home and welcomed.
I just had this conversation. I text Alex on Sunday because I was up in quote, I'm doing quotes, quote unquote, our section of the like where we sit on Sundays. And I was like, there's all these people, and there's people that I haven't met yet that have been here for a while. Like, I didn't know what to do. I just went up and talked to them, and they've been sitting there for a while. And I'm like, Alex, did I do the right thing? And just like you just saying like, okay, just people knowing your name and that you know who they are and that you care about them is enough. That you notice somebody is enough. You don't have to be this person that's going to solve all their problems or learn everything about them, but just knowing like, I see you and I'm glad that you're here and I know that you're here makes such a difference. And so that's something that I guess I've just been thinking about even this week, of just like even how we can apply that to our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, that's so good. And that's probably something that a lot of the people that walk into No Shame haven't felt for a long time, is that I'm seen, I'm noticed, somebody understands me, what I'm going on. And so there's just such power in that kind of community of common understanding and common language and, common problems and common joys and overcoming. So good. Well, I love, what you guys are talking about. It's so fun to hear that you guys have a space here at Christ Community, and we'll be praying that, God continues to use you all to get into other churches and spaces where people can work on their mental wellness, and people can meet Jesus in that. They can meet Jesus through meeting other people in that, because we all have the Spirit living in us. But are there any other closing thoughts or things you want to make sure we cover before jetting out of here?
Yeah, just so you know, we have 4 areas of real emphasis. First is getting rid of that stigma, and thank you for having me on this show. This is a big part of it. Hearing you say that you went to a coach or a team thing and you were feeling uncomfortable, it helps people to know they're not the only ones going through that.
Yeah.
Second, we talked about the groups. Groups are creating wellness communities where people can be themselves and feel safe, secure, seen. The third thing we do is we have mental health coaches. And I know Christ Community Church signed up through Light University, and they have mental health coaches. We want to multiply to where we have at least 200 in our community. That way, when somebody's just starting their mental health journey, or they get out of the hospital and they don't know where to go, they're not in the position I was with, okay, now what do? We can actually assign them somebody for 90 days and help walk them through the next 90 days and what they need to do. And then the last emphasis is mental wellness, right? We are not a mental health program. We are a mental wellness program. And we need to work on helping people be mentally well before they get mentally broken. Because once people are broken, and I can tell you from my own experience, it takes so much work and so much effort to get healthy, where I just wish I had somebody who would have helped walk me on a wellness journey early on in my life, so I didn't have to get in the position I was in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Larry, this has been
so good.
So good. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your own journey and how God kind of used the broken parts of it, the mess of that. I'm often reminded that usually God uses our pain and not our competencies to bring healing to people the most. And we have to try to convince ourselves, we need our competencies. The best parts of us is what's going to bring healing. But in my own life, it's hearing this and how God catalyzes those in our hearts to be able to bring hope and healing to others. So thanks for what you guys are doing. We'll keep praying for that. Thank you all for listening to today's podcast. If you've got any questions, you can always reach out to us on the podcast at podcast@cccomaha.org. You can find us on Instagram, TikTok @CCCOMA podcast. leave us a voicemail, 402-885-9930. Look up No Shame online. We'll put that in the show notes. But until next time, we will talk to you then.